cities all over the world are working on ways to integrate bicycle transport, becoming bicycle friendly. And we have a story to tell from New York. It's only been a few years from a time when New York was, for most people, a very scary place to try to ride a bike. Now cycling is something that's being embraced by many people. It's the fastest growing method of transportation in the city. It fits in with a lot of the new development in the city in terms of population growth, acceptance of public transport as the primary way to get around the city. And you know, we've reached a period in a very short period where you now have lines of traffic, real numbers of bike traffic riding toward the bridges from Brooklyn to Manhattan each morning. You see lines of cyclists stopping, you know, on key routes at the intersections. And it's something that you didn't see in the city, you know, 5 and certainly not 10 years ago. And we're also reaching a point where it's not just young, risk-taking people who are willing to come into the streets on a bike and, you know, try to move the taxis over. But it's people from different age groups, from different parts of the city, from different walks of life, who are now able to choose cycling as their main means of transportation, or at least use cycling for part of the way they travel in the city. So how do we get there? I think the accumulation of experience in the last 10 years has given us this basic recipe for how you can go from a place where cycling is not really a presence on our streets to a place where you have huge numbers of bikes on the streets in a very short time. We really looked at Paris as a tremendous model in trying to figure it out. And I think anybody who wants to look at how you go from a place that's scary to ride bikes to a place that's a real center of cycling in the 21st century really needs to look at the model of Paris as an important starting point. And I think, and you see these in different ratios or different mixes around the world. You really have to create safe places on the street for people to ride bikes. You can do education, you can talk about it, you can exhort people and talk about climate change, but people have to feel like it's going to be safe before they will get on a bike on a city street. So and I think you need streets that connect to each other that are bike friendly. You can't just have a bike lane here, a bike lane there. There needs to be a real network. You really need to think about it as a new mode of transportation and think about all that means in terms of streets, connections, information, ways to get people to do it. You know, our other modes of transportation represent billions of dollars, decades of development. We need to bring the same kind of effort to cycling. It's more cost-effective cycling, but you need to bring the same level of thinking, integrating from, you know, telling people, giving them the information. You know, with cars, we have thousands of miles of highways and streets. We have radio programs telling people the conditions. You have you know, lighting, laws, all kinds of design standards for streets. We need to bring all those things to cycling to really get to where we need to go. I think one of the things that can really accelerate the progress once you start to change your streets and make it easier to ride bikes is the large-scale public bike system. And I know some places are doing more. You know, I think it's the third step. Some places are making it the first step. I think they all need to go together, regardless of where you start. Public bikes can really accelerate the acceptance of cycling. That's part of our experience in New York. They can make it easier for people who live in small apartments, for people who may not have a place for a bike, people who've had bad experiences owning a bike. It's an important strategy, but I think it's critical that it goes with the other pieces. In thinking about this cycling as a new mode of transportation, these are just some of the numbers that we've started to achieve in New York. Really changing the streets has been the critical part of it. And keeping track of what happens when you do that. What are the numbers of cyclists? What are the crash rates? And with public bikes, you get a lot of data really quickly because the machine count that you get from public bikes, you know, gives you that data on a daily basis, which is really important. But it's critical to think about it from everything from parking to the law, to public opinion, and how you bring people along as you start to change your city. These things are all part of a strategy. In New York, it really began with leadership, and leadership is important because when you're going to change a city, you're generally going to be in for a fight. We knew that starting in New York. Mayor Bloomberg announced a new sustainability policy in 2007. It said the city will be a better place with fewer cars, that we are going to absorb growth with public transport, that we were going to make the streets more welcoming to people and not just as corridors to move vehicles through, and that we were going to treat bicycling as this real mode of transportation and really think about it the same way we think about other forms of transport and apply all of our planning tools and all of our efforts that we put into other forms of transport to bicycling as well. And we set goals. We said we count bikes on key streets and bridges. We wanted to see those numbers double in 3 years. We wanted to see them triple in 6 years. So we were setting real goals. We said when the sustainability program came out, we would have 200 new miles of bike lanes in the city within 3 years. And those kind of things are important. You really cannot make a city bike friendly unless you have a regular program that says we will do 50 miles or 100 kilometers, whatever your goal is, on a regular basis, and then you have the staff and the money dedicated to doing those things on a regular basis. It's going to take many, many years to make all of New York City bike friendly. We're still certainly a work in progress. It's not done. It's not bike paradise. I tell people Copenhagen was not built in a day. It took them 40 years to get to where they are, and we're going much faster. This is just the idea that, and you know this in Madrid, you have these fantastic networks of pedestrian streets, more than we have in New York, but really thinking about how people want to use streets, not worrying so much about how do we look at the numbers today and accommodate all the traffic, but thinking about what people will do if you change things. And you knew in Times Square, everybody was crowded in and crushed on the sidewalks, and we didn't see that as necessary. And so we found ways to close the street, give it to people, and they responded immediately. Part of the mayor's policy was very strongly integrated across the spectrum of issues to change streets. So there's a very strong focus on safety. And I think safety and sustainability have to go hand in hand when you talk about city streets. You can't say, we want you to try cycling if people aren't going to feel safe. We can't say, that the driving culture allows for safe cycling when we know it doesn't, and that we know we have to change that. I think culture follows the street design itself, and you can slow people down by doing that. But this was part of a broader strategy. It wasn't just New York is becoming bike friendly. It was that we see the streets as a resource that has not been well used. The 20th century, the overwhelming concern for traffic engineering really crowded out a lot of other concerns and disciplines in city planning, and we're taking that back so that you could think about economic development and what's better for a street. You think about neighborhood health and what people would like to see their streets as, rather than just give the entire street system over to engineers who are thinking primarily about numbers of vehicles. And so thinking about public space as well as streets as our front yards in a crowded city. We don't have most of the space between buildings is the streets. And so just, changing things, trying things quickly, not taking a full reconstruction, but putting up some objects, putting out some seating and watching people appear, and proving the concept very quickly. So that's really been probably the biggest contribution of New York. I mean, we've borrowed bus strategies from Latin America. We borrowed a public bike strategy from Paris. We looked at all across the world at different bike lane strategies. But going fast, I think, was one of the contributions of New York, and saying, look, we can do this in a few weeks. We can bring out the planters. We can paint the street. We can put some sculpture. and just rearrange things quickly and see how it works. And many of these have been adjusted and changed because you learn as you go. Maybe this street was changed from two-way to one-way, became much safer, and then we got space for more pedestrians, for public space, and for the pieces of the bike network. Now, as I said, I think when you want to introduce cycling as a real mode of transportation, you need a very strong network. But you also need to think about what is the long-term approach to the network and what allows you to change the streets, to engage in that fight that is going to happen. You know, when you change streets in a big city, you're going to get a fight, and you're going to hear all kinds of nonsense and end-of-the-world scenarios being offered by the people who don't want these things changed. And you need to think about how you're going to win that fight before you start. So New York in the period before the mayor's plan in the early 2000s, the 1990s, and going back to the 1980s, New York was under pressure from cycling groups, NGOs, environmentalists, to do more of the kinds of things I've been talking about. And so the city would do some bike lanes every few years, mostly under pressure from these outside groups. And you can see it's very scattered. It was put in, it was convenient to put it here. We didn't have to change anything for cars. You did a little bit here and there. They mostly were just painted lines on streets. It wasn't very generous. And it certainly wasn't strategic. And then, 7 years later, you can see there's a lot more. It's been a lot more filled in, but it's still, on a citywide basis, it's still somewhat scattered, except in a couple of areas. And that's at the lower part of the screen. The lower half of Manhattan and the upper half of Brooklyn is filled in a very dense network, and it's very interconnected. And we made a clear decision, a very clear strategic point to put most of the bike lanes and to really connect the bike lanes well in there. And that's because that was the part of the city that already had people on the street bicycling. That was where you could count the most bikes on a street, where people were already using bikes. Part of it was the demographic. It was the right groups of people there who we knew were more inclined to use bikes. Partly it's the neighborhoods are just easier for cycling there with smaller streets, close-in neighborhoods. But we said, okay, if we really build that out, we'll get even more people using bikes in those neighborhoods. We make that our focus area. What we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate success. We're going to lead with success, and we're going to make sure we don't take on the hardest problem first. We take on the easier problems first. Once we've demonstrated success, then we start to win the battle over changing our streets, and then we can move on to the rest of the city. And so that was the really key filling in of the bike network in 2007 to 2009. And we were able to show through the numbers that we were having huge increases in cycling in those areas. And so the rest of the city is, and I don't have the 2014, there were more, another 50 miles added. But we know we're not going to change all of New York City streets. It's 10,000 miles in a few years. We're going to start somewhere and build out from there. And you can see the beginnings of some networks in the middle of Manhattan. This part above Brooklyn is Western Queens. There's a lot of demand for bike network there now. And even up into the Bronx, we have a lot of north-south routes. We need to start connecting those with east-west routes and filling in more and more. So this is a work in progress, but the idea was to have a real political sensibility when you start so that you show success, you show the potential, and if you're really good, you start to generate demand in other parts of the city. And that's exactly what happened in New York. So really, if you look at this focus area where I talked about, if you live in any part of this area, you're only a few blocks at most from bike lanes. And you can get on these bike lanes, and often in this part of Brooklyn, people are riding bikes to the bridges to go to work. The bridges have very good bike lanes on them. The green lanes are more separated. The red lanes are more paint. But more and more, we have the painted lanes on smaller streets leading to more separated lanes on the larger streets where you really need the protection. So this is something that's a new feature in the city just since 2007, having this density of bike lanes. I think is really what it takes to get large numbers of people on the streets. And you need to have that network strategy. And you need to keep track of what you're doing because as you engage in this ongoing battle, you can talk about the actual facts. And most of your opponents have no information. They just have an idea that change is bad. This is sort of the snapshot of what has happened. This is the bike network. It doesn't look like a very steep rise, but if you look at the numbers, it's kind of a doubling of the bike network. Many more riders, and it's not comprehensive counts, but it's year over year counting where we do the counts on key routes. Very importantly, not more people being hurt. And so the rate of crashes is going down dramatically as the amount of cycling increases. But to me, one of the most interesting things is our planners developed a way of measuring the connectivity in the bike network so that we could basically count how many places bike lanes crossed each other and how easy it was for somebody to make a trip and to stay in the bike network. And to me, what's interesting is when you get that steep increase in connectivity in 2007 to 2010, you see the steepest increase in the number of cyclists as well. Now, I've applied this connectivity measure to some other cities that I've been doing some work in, and some places are much better than New York, including new cycling cities like Buenos Aires. And that's because we still have a lot of these unconnected bike lanes in the Bronx and in parts of Queens. If you did the connectivity analysis for that focus area in Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, it would be much, much higher. And I think it'll continue to increase the more you add bike lanes into a network, the greater the connections are going to be. But you have to have that. You have to say to most people who are going to be willing to think about cycling, you can get most of the way from your house to your job, from your house to your friend's house, from your house to the movies, in the bike network. You're not going to be just left off in heavy traffic somewhere part of the way, because then people are not going to do it. A few people will do it, but not very many. So I think another important contribution that New York has made is figuring out how to make streets safe for cyclists quickly, without heavy construction or moving of pieces of the street. Now, in this is the standard design now for Busy Avenue in Manhattan. And these cars just to the left are parked. They used to park here where the green lane is. And with the traffic rules, we just moved the parking out. And so now we have a new space in between the sidewalk and the row of parked cars. And that gives people a place where they're not exposed to moving traffic to ride bikes. We call it the parking protected bike lane. And this is now on many of the Manhattan avenues. And this, I think, is one of the things that has allowed many, many people to embrace cycling, to ride their bikes to work, and to use bikes for general transportation in the city. Because maybe they lived in a nice neighborhood in Brooklyn, and they were willing to ride around the block to the store, or ride to the next neighborhood to visit someone, or for an appointment. But they were not going to come to Manhattan and get on these big avenues. And almost all the north-south streets in Manhattan are these big avenues, 4 lanes, 6 lanes, really difficult places to ride a bike if you're not some kind of athlete or daredevil. And so this has made these avenues friendly to bikes. You get a little better picture of it here, where you can see that the parking has been moved out. There's now some pedestrian space created as well, and the bike lane is taken from the moving traffic. And the traffic is actually much safer too, because now there's only 1 lane of cars on the street, so nobody's speeding, nobody's trying to pass each other, no one's weaving around and trying to do things that lead to crashes. So it's all more predictable. Predictable equals safety in traffic. We know where the bikes will be. We know where the cars will be. We know cars aren't going to be passing anybody. And the pedestrians have more space. We find in these designs with the separated bike lane, everybody is safer. Fewer crashes, fewer injuries to motorists, fewer injuries to pedestrians, and fewer injuries to cyclists, even though the numbers of cyclists are much, much higher. And this has caught on, this whole idea of using the parking to protect the bikes. This is in downtown Chicago. a slightly different design with a two-way lane. But this is happening all over the country, and we're seeing it. I saw some examples of this in São Paulo, Brazil, last fall. And so this really has changed the nature of some of these streets, much more friendly, much less space devoted to moving traffic, and you get great increases in the bike volumes. And it's not just in Manhattan now. We're increasingly changing some of the old painted lanes to these protected lanes in neighborhoods like this one in Brooklyn. This was actually the center of all the fighting over bike lanes in New York, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. Some people thought this was the worst thing in the world. But now it's not only part of a mobility network that allows people to get around Brooklyn and from Brooklyn to Manhattan, it's become a neighborhood recreational asset as well. So you see a lot of families and kids using these safe lanes. This is a street where nobody would ever bring a kid on a bike before this was changed. And there was a problem because the bikes were using the sidewalk and scaring pedestrians and some of the elderly people who live in the neighborhood. Now we have a place for everybody, and it's much safer. As I said, a lot of the lanes in neighborhoods are these painted lanes. They generally lead you to the bigger, safer lanes. And these work pretty well in lower volume streets. And we find, cars can still drive into these lanes or park in them, which is a bigger problem. But most people respect the markings on the streets, and so even doing these painted lanes really increases safety. It increases the volume of bike traffic. We found also through studies that streets that have more of the streetscaping that aren't just sort of general lanes for traffic, they tend to get more people coming to the shops and actually perform better economically. And then when we do go to rebuild the whole street, and then we place the painted lanes or the lanes that are just set off with parking or planters with full reconstruction. But this is, in New York, this rebuilding streets from the ground up is a very painfully slow process. So it's good to have a fast strategy, and then it's good to follow those quickly created facilities with permanent materials that are attractive. But this is another avenue in Manhattan now where the bike lane's been integrated into the center or the park-like part of the street. The city has a very big effort to build bike racks, finding as cycling grows that the bikes on the street get in the way of people walking. We took parking away from this street and extended the sidewalk. This is a busy subway station in Brooklyn, just one stop from Manhattan. So there's so many bikes parked around here that we needed to move them away from the subway station and give them a little more space. There's an even bigger stand of racks around the corner. And there's a newer program that allows people with stores to ask that their car parking in front be changed to bike parking. And this is popular for a lot of the store owners because you can get 12 people to park here instead of one. And it's a way to keep the bikes from crowding up narrow sidewalks by just repurposing the parking space from cars to bikes. And as part of the push through the mayor's sustainability plan, we changed some of the laws so that buildings that have a service elevator cannot refuse bikes to come into the building. So if the office says, we have space for bikes, we'd like cyclists to be able to bring bikes up to the office, the building has to allow them into the service elevator. And so then you have people parking bikes, like on the 40th floor in some of the main buildings, office buildings in Manhattan. And the rules for new construction or renovating buildings say you have to create bike parking space in the new buildings, or if you're rebuilding an older building. So over time, these things are being built into the fabric of the city, so that you don't have, if you have an expensive bike, you don't leave it on the street for a long work day, but you can bring it in, and it's not forcing anybody to do this if they don't want bikes in their office, but if they do allow bikes in their office, the building can't say no. So I talked about the fight that happens when you try to change things in a big city full of opinionated people. We even got a new word for it in New York. The backlash is a play on words on the English word backlash, which means, strong negative reaction to maybe a new development. So when you change things in a city, some people will complain. We had a few neighborhoods saying, no, we don't want these bike lanes, and coming to community forums and going to the press and saying, we're really against this. This is making things worse, and we like our parking, and this isn't going to work. And we had one neighborhood, the neighborhood in Brooklyn with the big green bike lane, took us to court, and they sued us over the changing of the street, even though the representatives from that neighborhood had asked us to put in the bike lane because there was a safety problem on that street, and they felt that taking a lane of traffic away would make things safer, and they were right. But we nonetheless, we were taken to court. And so this was not really that big a fight. There was some grumbling, but especially in a big city, the press loves a fight. And the press loves to declare a culture war over something. And so that's what happened in New York. We had a few neighborhood arguments blown up into a citywide culture war, given the name Bicklash. And some of the editorial writers were really mean and would make things up. And so, we were under pressure. If you're in city government, you live in that bubble of press and having to respond. And, when one newspaper starts asking questions, then all the newspapers start asking that question. And, the TV people want to interview you about that question. So we had this fight, and we got sued. And I think the way we eventually won the battle had a few different dimensions. One is, as I said, if you're changing things, you really need to count what's happening. You need to keep track of real information. And as a city government, you have a great advantage because you're producing the information. And very few other people have the ability to produce real information. This is just another look at the bike counts I showed you before. And so we were counting this trend in cycling, very closely. And so that was one of the key things to winning the battle of the backlash, which was just showing that it was working, that people were voting with their pedals and saying, these bike lanes are here and we're using them. We also kept track of these things on a project basis, where if you put a new bike lane into an avenue, you need to have some data from before, and then you need to see what happens when you change it. In this case, in Columbus Avenue in Manhattan, we didn't even take a lane away. We found that the lanes were really wide. So we narrowed them and put in the protected bike lane. So we're able to say, when you go to a community forum and people are complaining about the bike lane, that bike volumes are up by 50%, and there are fewer crashes for everybody. And that makes it much harder to argue against. And it gives your supporters, and I spent 7 years in city government rallying supporters. When we have a forum, and this can be hard to teach people in government, but you need to fight to win. If you're going to do these things, you need to win, so that you need to have your supporters working on these issues. You need to mobilize them. You need to keep those organizations in communication and growing. You don't have to, it's not a conspiracy, but you do need to be talking to the people who want these things, as well as responding to the people who are fighting them. But information is power, and so creating this kind of information is really, really critical as you're changing the streets. But what really happened with the backlash was, as I said, when one newspaper asked a question, another newspaper asked the same question. And so this became enough of an issue in the city where everybody was talking about it, in vast disproportion, I would say, to some of the other issues that the city's facing. It got the people who actually measure what people think interested in the issue. Mostly when you're doing a poll about New York City, you think, well, is the mayor doing a good job? What do you think of the mayor's education policies and his changes to the schools? What do you think of the police commissioner and his latest initiative against, whatever crime? Now they started saying, well, do you support the city's policy for more bike lanes? And there wasn't just one of these polls. There were 7 polls in 2 years, and they all found the same thing, that 2/3 of people thought this was great. despite all the bad press and all the media hype about fighting about bike lanes, 2/3 of people said, yeah, we want this, and we want more of this, and this is great. So it's, it's really interesting, and it's a lesson for people who live in that bubble of City Hall and the press, that oftentimes real people are outside that bubble, and they're not really tuned into it. And they're not hearing all the bad press that, you were reading 6 newspapers a day and watching all the TV, the 24-hour news. Most people don't do that, and they have their own views of things. And you need to get that information out about what people really think. And you'll find that people want a more people-friendly, pedestrian-friendly, and bike-friendly city. And then the thing that really turned the corner on the bike lash in New York, we went from bike lash in 2011 to Bike City in 2013, was launching the public bike system in New York. It's called City Bike. It's got a bank sponsor. And once that hit the streets, and there was a lot of fighting over putting the stations in the streets as well, once people started riding the bikes and reporters started going out on test runs for the bikes, and you could show within weeks that thousands of people were using it and you were getting tens of thousands of trips per day, it changed almost immediately. And reporters were calling saying, how many trips this week? And it became just something everybody was talking about. It became something that it really was the story for the city that summer in 2013. And it became something that was much more accessible to people. It wasn't just like guys in their 20s riding around. It was everybody, and people visiting were enjoying it. It just really worked for people, and it's very photogenic. It's a little more, it provides a better image than just like a big mass of different kinds of bikes parked together. But I think what really led the way to it was changing the streets for 6 years before launching the bike share. So this is just a snapshot. So just to show, this was only 2 months after we launched. We were getting 40,000 rides a day in that summer on 6,000 bikes. It was tremendous, and I think it points to the strategies that we learned from Paris. We watched Velib. When I first started in city government in 2007, some of us were new in government because we came in specifically for the mayor's sustainability policy. They needed new people to do these new things. And one of the first things that got to my desk was a memo from a deputy mayor with a Financial Times article about Velib, saying, what do we think about this? Should we do this? And we said, yes, we should do this, but not right now. We need to change the streets and make the city ready for this. And I think that's what we did. This is where the city bike stations are today. It's a Manhattan Central Business District, the key part of the city, and a few neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And if you remember from the maps I showed you earlier, it's exactly the same place where we focused the bike lanes in the first push to build the network. So we changed the streets in this area, and then we brought in the bike sharing system behind it. And I think that worked really well. It gave people a safe place to ride. It made it very easy to use the public bikes the day they turned on. And the critical lesson everybody needs to learn from Velib and Paris is that the stations need to be very close together. A lot of American cities are doing bike share, and they don't really know why they're doing bike share. They're doing bike share because everyone else is doing bike share, but they're not really learning the lesson. And there's a planning principle for bike sharing systems that you can't change, and that's how far people are willing to walk. Walking is the key to bike share, so you have to make the stations very close together. Because in a place like this, and this is just a shot from the phone app for the system in Manhattan, and the green lines are the bike lanes, there's so much travel being generated. There's so many people going in so many directions in a place like this. Every single building is causing hundreds of trips per day. If you make it easy for those people to use the bike, they will, or some proportion of them will. And the way you make it easy is you put it right outside their door. So you have to learn the lesson and make sure it's very, very tight. In Washington, D.C., for example, they've spaced the bike share stations out so they could cover the whole city with the first phase. And they're too hard to get to for many people. And it's already a hard city to get around, so people do use the bikes, but they could do more if they had the tighter. And so I think it's better to leave part of the city out and let them be angry that they don't have it. That's a good thing. If you're in charge of the program, you want more people asking for it, even if you can't satisfy them right away. So having demand that you're not meeting is good. It'd be worse if you put it across the whole city in a low density way and nobody was using it, then you would never expand. But if it's this principle of leading with success. Make it work, and then people will ask for it. And so that's very important. And so in some places, the stations are very, very big to meet the demand in New York. This is right outside of Grand Central Terminal, the second biggest train station in the city. So you have to go big, and you have to really think about this as a mode of transportation. When you think about bicycling as a real mode of transportation, you could have twice this many bikes in this spot, and people would still use all of them. So I think it's important to scale things in a serious way. You can't just say we're going to have a few bikes because a few people will use them. You want to make this big, and we actually closed the street. This was open for taxis coming down to the station. Now it's a pedestrian space and a bike share hub. And as I said, it's opened to a different demographic. We see sort of all walks of life using the bikes in New York. It started at 6,000 bikes. It's recently been announced to double to 12,000 and to expand into new neighborhoods. I had our staff measure how close these things were, and most of them are very close to not just any painted bike lane, but the actual physical protected bike lanes. And I think that's made a big difference in the usage. People have a safe place to ride, and I think, once again, there's no way to sort of undercount or to discount the importance of safe places to ride if you're creating a space for bikes. If you want to make bikes a real method of transport in the city. I think one of the real tests and the true test of a new public policy is whether it can survive into an environment with new leadership. So Mayor Bloomberg left office at the end of 2013. Mayor Bill de Blasio was elected and took office at the beginning of last year. And in many ways, de Blasio, his campaign was to be the anti-Bloomberg. He campaigned on the idea of inclusivity and affordability, and having a billionaire mayor before him made that an easy way to sort of structure his campaign. But what's interesting is in street policy and transportation, it's almost there's almost total continuity in the policies. And the way that his political people sort of figured it out was they declared that safety on the street was going to be a top priority for the de Blasio administration. They adopted the Swedish policy of Vision Zero, saying we should do everything we can to make sure we have no more, we get to almost no traffic fatalities in the future. This is him signing a law increasing penalties for dangerous driving in the city with the families of people who have been killed in traffic. And the mayor has been very strong on these issues, and this policy framework has allowed him to embrace traffic calming and bike lanes and city bike without saying Bloomberg was right. It's given him a new way to talk about it, because they don't want to say Bloomberg was right, even though Bloomberg was right in the case of streets, and their policy shows that. And so the mayor, this is his transportation commissioner named Polly Trottenberg. She's accepting an award from Bicycling Magazine, which last year declared by New York as the #1 cycling city in the country. And she helped to develop the new contract to double the size of City Bike, to take it to a much bigger area. So City Bike is now in the blue zone. In this spring, it will start to go into the orange zone. And the orange zone will be finished sometime in 2016, I think. And the idea, and there's planning and exploration going on for the yellow area, the phase 3, where we could see the system grow to as many as 20,000 bikes. And I think there are places to the east of this map even that could also support bike share with the density and the public transit connections. And I think one important piece that I didn't mention, especially from Madrid, where your public transport is so good, in the surveys we've done of the city bike riders, nearly half of them use it in connection with another form of transport. Maybe they have an awkward subway ride with many connections, so they use the bike to cut out some of the connections and just get to the main line they want to be on. They're using the bikes to get to ferry docks. They're using the bike in the morning and taking the subway home, or they just have a strange schedule that day. It means, so we have many people who own bikes who also have a city bike subscription, because sometimes it's just not convenient to have your bike with you, but you still want to use the bike for part of the day. It really works once you've started to change your streets. So I think time is on the side of change. One of the things I noticed in years of work on this is most of the people fighting about changing streets, making them more pedestrian friendly, and fighting about bikes were over 55 years old. Not everybody over 55 years old is fighting this, but most of the opponents were older. Now, we have new people being elected all the time in the city to the city council. These two guys, younger than me, they represent neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and to them, they're new in office. They were elected in 2013. And to them, it's obvious that we should have more bike lanes in their neighborhoods, and that city bike should expand to their neighborhoods, and that their constituents want those things in their neighborhoods. So these guys are riding their bikes to work, to City Hall from Brooklyn. And as newer generations come up, I teach a course at New York University. Every kid entering planning in the United States on city planning wants to work on bike and pedestrian issues. The younger generations want this. They've in New York, in the United States and many other countries, we're seeing the rates of driving and the rates of car purchase by younger people going down rapidly. And they like the sort of application-based idea where they can live in a city, they can join a city bike membership, they can have a car sharing membership. We have Zipcar and Car2Go, two companies in New York offering car share. They can get on their phone the subway schedule, the bus schedule, Uber and all of that. So they can look at their phone and decide, I have to go here at this time of day. What's my best choice? And people like choices. People don't want to have to be forced into driving in cities. They want to think about any manner of ways of getting around. And choice equals, having lots of choices is a higher quality of life. And I think those are the cities that offer choices, that offer those different kinds of environments. Sure, you can get a car, you can own a car, but you don't need it all the time. And you don't even need to own it if you don't want to spend that kind of money. That's what's starting to happen in cities. So that's the short story of how New York went from cycling for a tiny handful of risk takers to cycling for people who really don't want to take any risks and who are able to still now choose cycling in many parts of the city. Certainly not all of the city yet, but more of the city every year. Thank you very much.